guys, welcome to HSC Earth and Environmental Science and Module 6 on hazards. This is video number 14 and the last in our little mini-series on climatic phenomena and ecosystems. This time we're going to focus on bushfires. So the learning intention is the same as it has been for all of the three previous videos, that we evaluate causes and impacts of climate phenomena on local ecosystems, but this time we're going to focus on bushfire. So as we've mentioned, it's about describing the cause of bushfires, the impact in both a descriptive and an evaluative sense, so that we can kind of link what's going on with this particular type of hazard to our local environment. So what are bushfires? Well, bushfires are very much a part of the Australian scene. They're generally described as uncontrolled, non-structural fires which burn in grass, scrub, bush, or forested area. There's two main types that we can see, those that are really, I guess, more mountainous and those that are more on the flatlands or grasslands. Now, depending on where these are located, how dense the bush is, and also the exposure to things like wind, this can be fires that are kept relatively in control or can burn virtually absolutely out of control. So this is one of the reasons why fire can be such a major hazard in Australia, and of course why we also have a bit of a history of hazardous bushfires turning into disasters. One particularly important one, I guess, for us to think about in New South Wales are the bushfires that occurred through the summer of 2019-2020. There was some absolute devastation that occurred as a result of these fires, but unfortunately very close on the heels of all of these fires and some of the recovery efforts was the beginning of the first COVID-19 pandemic. And as a result of that, I think in a lot of ways we kind of shifted our focus as a society and forgot some of the people who had already suffered immense losses as a result of these bushfires. In Australia, we're geographically and meteorologically diverse, so there's lots of different climates, different zones that occur throughout Australia, and so therefore there's a huge range of different types of fires. And that's what we want to try and get a little bit of a sense of as we have this little bit of a look at fires, is what's causing these different types of fires, how can they be related to climatic phenomena, and what sort of an impact are they going to have on the local ecosystem. So what are the hazards associated with bushfires? Well, if we think about fires, we think about three important components. And the first of those is the fuel. The second is heat. And the third is oxygen. So these three components are very important. They form a little fire triangle. And this is what we have an awful lot of in the Australian bush. We have a huge amount of fuel. Obviously, oxygen is going to be something that's only going to be a problem if the fire is kind of smothering, or if it's contained in some way where there's not much access to oxygen. And in fact, most of the time you see from the color of fire that oxygen conditions can be relatively low and we can still have an awful lot of fire. The fact that we get so much smoke, so much soot, so much carbon forming is telling you something about the fact that this is actually an incomplete combustion event. So if you think about the Bunsen burner flame, when we have the collar closed, we don't have as much oxygen getting in, so we get the orange flame. And if we put anything above that flame, we get a lot of soot covering it. That's the classic case for most of the Australian bushfires. So even though we need oxygen, we don't have an awful lot of it, and so it doesn't burn as cleanly. When you turn that Bunsen burner onto open the collar a little bit, you turn it onto the blue flame, then you get much better burning, you get more efficient energy being produced as a result of the combustion reaction, and you also get a more pure product. So you don't get as much soot, you get carbon dioxide forming as your product. Now, these will still be the case when we look at Australian bushfires, but the one other thing that's very important and is linked to our study of climatic phenomena, and particularly our El Nino events, is heat. So in El Nino years, we have hot, dry conditions, and these are ideal conditions if we want bushfires. So the heat, as well as the fuel source, high fuel sources and oxygen, are going to lead to these tremendous and potentially disastrous bushfires. If areas haven't had fire in some reasonable amount of time, we're sort of looking at about 10 years, then they're starting to really build those sorts of fuel loads, especially in terms of the understory, that are going to allow fires to move very, very quickly through an area. A lot of the fires that occur in Australia are as a result of lightning strikes. You can sometimes actually walk through the bush and see trees that have been hit by lightning. But unfortunately, lightning isn't the only cause of fire in Australia. There has certainly been a number of occasions where humans have deliberately lit fires, sometimes as part of a land management practice, other times just as a result of either neglect or deliberate action in order to try and see the fire burn. Sometimes rural fire service will actually be involved in active backburning, and this is a technique that's designed to try and remove some of that fuel load, or at least reduce some of that fuel load, so that should a fire come through, it's easier to contain and it's less likely to cause the sorts of devastating damages that we know that bushfires can. So what's the problem with in terms of the local ecosystem? Well, there's some obvious things that are associated between bushfires and the local ecosystem. And one of the main things is that the big devastating fires can delay recovery by years. So this is really for the big fires. So when we haven't been managing the land particularly well, when we have been kind of leaving our forests alone, that can actually create more problems. We end up with that big fuel load in the understory. We end up with the fire, when it does come through, is very intense. And as a result of that, we can get these sort of huge fires coming through that can take long, long periods of time before recovery starts to occur. The clearance of vegetation can often create instability in the soil, particularly in the topsoils, and that can increase the chances of erosion, both as a result of wind and also water. So if it then does rain, often we can exacerbate some of the problems by some of that nice rich humus and topsoil layers being washed away. Plants that have been burnt through fire can often be invaded by introduced species. A lot of introduced species are very much opportunistic, so they get the opportunity to jump into an area which has been devastated, where there's minimal or no competition, and so their fast growth rates, fast reproductive rates, means they can colonize those areas sometimes quicker than the native species can, and so we end up with quite a change in the vegetation and the ecosystem as a result. It's, I guess, fairly obvious too that animals can lose their lives. They can also lose their habitat. Animals may be in a position where they can sense the fire coming and get out of the way. Often those gases that are associated with incomplete combustion, which is carbon monoxide, a high amount of soot in the air, can have a choking effect on animals too. So even if they're not burnt by the fire, they can often be killed as a result of the gases and the smoke that's being produced as a result. They can, if they survive all of that, come back and find that their homes have been destroyed or their food supplies have been destroyed. And again, that can put our native animals under pressure. But what's nice is that, I guess, the fact that bushfires have been part of the Australian scene for so long, that we've actually seen a lot of interesting adaptations that plants and animals have shown to these sorts of regular fires that occur. Interesting to study the plants because, of course, the animals can get up and move. The plants can't. They can't do anything once a fire comes through. So there has to be some strategies that they have that have to be put in place because they can't go anywhere. And so we see some of the resin cones for things like the Banksias. They're very classic. The resin seals those seed pods and has to be subject to quite high temperatures, the sorts of temperatures that you get when a fire comes through, in order for that resin to melt and for the seeds to be tossed out. So as long as that happens after the fire's gone through, the heat comes through, the seeds go down, they fall into that nice rich topsoil, and as long as it doesn't get eroded away, they're in a position to recolonize just that little bit quicker. We also see a couple of important structures, and you can see one of these kind of sitting in the backdrop of this slide, which are epicormic buds. And I'm sure if you've ever driven past an area that's been devastated by fire, you can see all the black trunks of the trees, and then occasionally you can see these little green shoots kind of appearing through the black bark. Those are epicormic buds. They're little buds that sit underneath the bark, and they can spring through once the fire's passed, and you can see new growth that results from that. Lignotubers tend to be down at the base of the tree, so from the root system, and they sometimes you can see little twigs and new stems starting to emerge around the base of the tree, and that's the result of lignotubers. So again, these are adaptations. These are specific things that we see that are responses of the Australian native plants to this constant threat of fire that's moving through, and it allows the plants to recolonize an area more quickly as a result of a fire coming through. I talked initially about the 2020 fires in New South Wales and the fact that we kind of lost some of the goodwill. There was an awful lot of goodwill amongst the population, a lot of fundraising efforts that went in, a lot of people going to help people in the communities that have been devastated by these fires. But very quickly we realized that with COVID, that was starting to have a more personal impact on more people. We were starting to isolate. And I think, unfortunately, one of the things that happened as a result is that the consequences of the fires were a little forgotten. At the moment, we're in the opposite problem, where we've had so much rain from our east coast low that we've moved from these sort of drought, fire-prone conditions to flooding conditions. But the key when you're looking at each of these different types of phenomena is how you can link these to the climate. So what aspects of the climate are most likely to be supportive of this increased danger of bushfires as a hazard? So that's our little question to think about for this particular video, and thanks for watching.